Hey everyone, it's Colonel from the Headphone Show. Today with me I have the Philips SHP9600, which is an open back dynamic driver headphone that was introduced just over a month ago as a successor to the wildly popular SHP9500, a headphone that garnered quite a bit of praise for the level of performance it offered at the very reasonable price of $80. It varied depending on where you looked. So, at an MSRP of $129, a price tag that nearly doubles that of the SHP9500, does the SHP9600 bring any notable improvements to the table, and can it offer the same level of value that its predecessor did? Let's find out. Okay, so first things first, let's talk about the basics, starting off with power requirements, which for the SHP9600, I don't really think there are any. So, like its predecessor, these are extremely efficient. They come in at an impedance of 32 ohms and a sensitivity level of 101 dB per milliwatt. I found myself being able to easily power them with virtually everything I tried them on, whether it was my motherboard's onboard audio or a discrete headphone amplifier like the JDSi's Element 2. I thought that they sounded great and they didn't really exhibit any of the issues I would normally find when underpowering a headphone. So I think that these are a great option if you don't currently own a headphone amplifier. So for packaging, you'll find that you get the SHP9600, some paperwork, as well as a fairly long single-sided 3.5mm to 3.5mm 3-meter cable with a 1/4-inch adapter. The SHP9600 sports a new, slicker look than its predecessor. The somewhat tacky left-right white text indicators on the cup grills are gone, and they have been replaced with an all-black design that features very thin bronze rings around the grill's perimeter. Aside from those aesthetic changes, the build and structural design remain largely unchanged from that of the SHP9500. As is to be expected from a headphone in this price bracket, the build is composed almost entirely out of plastic, but with a steel reinforced headband. For the most part, this design feels very stable and well put together, with my only complaint being that the cups do have a bit of a rattle to them. Aside from that, I really doubt that these will give any users issues during regular usage. Comfort, I think, was one of the SHP9500's best features, and thankfully the same can be said for the SHP9600. When you combine their extremely light weight of 330 grams and their low clamp force, it makes it one of the easiest headphones to wear in day-long listening sessions. The ear cups on the SHP9600 are quite large, and the pads, although a little shallow, do allow plenty of room for your ears to fit in. The headband's comfort strap has ample padding, and I find that it distributes the headphone's weight very evenly without creating any sore spots or pressure points. The only comment I will make on comfort is that the sports clothing-like mesh that the pads are wrapped in may cause some slight discomfort or itching for some users, particularly those with facial hair. Okay, so we finally get to talk about how these sound, and in brief, I would personally describe the SHP9600 as having a slightly colored but energetic sound to it with a bit of a bass emphasis as well as some accentuation in the treble. This probably won't come as a surprise, but these are pretty reminiscent of the SHP9500. Both headphones share very similar tonal characteristics, but as we will discuss shortly, the SHP9600 does bring about some fairly noticeable tuning changes, and for the most part, I think that they're for the better. Let's start by talking about bass, which I actually think is pretty good for an open back headphone in the sub $150 range. So the SHP9600 has surprisingly good bass extension. I mean, it still sees quite a bit of roll off under 60 Hz, which I think was expected, but it's a lot more gradual in its decline than on the DT9090 Pro, the HD58X, and then on the original SHP9500, all which had much more drastic roll off and were more lacking in sub-bass depth as a result. I also think that these are actually a pretty good level of detail in the bass. I don't think they're quite as articulate as the DT990 Pro, which feels a lot more controlled by comparison, but they do sound a little bit tighter to me in this region of the frequency response than the HD58X. As for the bass response tuning, it sounds to me as though there is a fairly large bump at around 130 Hz, which occasionally made the bass on certain tracks come across as a bit swollen or one-note sounding, at least to me. But nonetheless, that mid-bass emphasis is very narrow, so there was still a clean transition from the upper bass into the lower mids. I think that for me, that bass tuning is just a little bit odd, but I do think that some might find it very enjoyable as it does add a little bit more presence in the bass region, and it almost gives it a little bit more kick. Okay, so now let's talk about mids. And the mid-range on the SHP9600 reminds me quite a bit of that of the SHP9500, which are also very reminiscent to me of that of the HD600. So for me, I would say that the mids on these have a very balanced, natural sound to them, and they only really felt like they deviated very slightly at two different spots. So to me, I think that there was a bit of a dip at around 2K, so I felt like the mids could use a little bit more energy and bite there by maybe 1 or 2 dB. And then also the upper mid range was just a tiny bit forward or shouty for me, but not by a lot. I didn't think it was quite as forward as on something like the HD58X, HD600, or HD650. So overall, I think that Philips got a really good mid-range tuning on this headphone. I think it has a very good tonality that's very natural. Mid-range resolution though is where I feel like these are quite lacking. So compared to the HD58X as well as the DT990 Pro, I feel like the SHP9600 comes across as a little grainier, and I also don't feel like there's enough of an upgrade over the SHP9500. They're actually pretty similar in that regard, which is a little bit disappointing given the $50 upcharge for these. For the last part of the frequency response, we have the highs, which is an area where I did run into some issues with the original SHP9500, as its treble was uneven and it did have some peaks that made the highs come through as strident and, at least for me, a little bit disagreeable. Now, the SHP9600 still has the same peaks, however, they've been greatly subdued by comparison. The main elevation still seems to be centered at around 6K, and it does introduce some noticeable glare as well as some sibilance, and it made cymbal crashes in particular come through with some added grit and harshness to them. Then there was also a little bit of extra presence at 8.5K, but that was hardly noticeable, and at worst, it only really added the slightest edge to consonant sounds. So I will reiterate that compared to the SHP9500, the peaks here have been greatly reduced, so it doesn't sound nowhere near as unnaturally brightened. However, I would still be cautious if you're a little bit treble sensitive, as I still think that the highs here could become just a little bit fatiguing in prolonged listening sessions. Moving along to soundstage imaging and layering, I wouldn't say that the SHP9600 sounds necessarily wider than something like an HD58X or HD600, but at least to me, it felt quite a bit more spacious, and I think that that's due to its imaging and layering. So for imaging, I actually find that this headphone performs really well. So the SHP9600 has a very good ability of conveying directionality as well as position. So it may not be quite as pinpoint accurate as the TT990 Pro, but I still felt like it was very good at discerning the direction from which sounds originated, and I felt like it kept up really well with online multiplayer games like Call of Duty Modern Warfare. Then there was also the instrument separation, which actually really impressed me. So all the different elements that compose the music that I listened to were extremely well defined and distinguished from each other. I never felt like anything got lost in the mix, and I actually feel like it did it better than the DT990 Pro, than stuff like the HD600. And I think that the only headphone that I've heard do it better, or the layering better under $500, has actually been the Hi-Fi Man Sundara. So again, it may not be the widest soundstage, but I do feel like it does have some very good spatial qualities on the SHP9600. Dynamics is another category where I feel like the SHP9600 performs really well. So low notes have a very good sense of punch and slam that hits with authority and delivers a satisfying physical impact. Then top end notes also have a nice weighted snap behind them that adds this feeling of tension behind things like string instruments or percussive strikes. So I feel like this dynamic quality makes for a very engaging listening experience on the SHP9600. Lastly, before we head into the conclusion, I just wanted to mention, as always, that I've made an EQ profile for these. So I don't feel like the SHP9600 really needs that much EQ, but for me personally, I am a little treble sensitive, so the highs were a little bit strident for me, so I do EQ them down, just tame the treble peaks just a little more, and also reduce that mid-bass bump. Now, My EQ preset for these will be available on a post I've made on the Headphones community forums that is basically a compilation of all my EQ settings. So if you'd like to try that out, there'll be a link in the description down below. Okay, so to wrap up this review, there's a couple of different conclusions from me. So the first thing is that to me, this feels more like a refinement over the SHP9500 rather than being a complementary headphone or some sort of generational upgrade. That being said though, I feel like Philips really nailed it in this refinement of the SHP9500 as it addresses most of the issues I had with the original's tonality while also improving comfort. Whether or not it's worth the additional $50 though, I feel like I can't really comment on as we all value things differently. Personally though, I think that if you already own an SHP9500, there isn't really any reason to upgrade to this one. There aren't really any major incentives as they are really very similar, especially if you use EQ. But if you don't have an SHP9500 and you're trying to get a taste of Philips headphone lineup or are just looking for an entry-level open back headphone, then I feel like this is a very solid option. The SHP9600 has minimal power requirements, it's extremely comfortable, and it does have a fun, enjoyable tonality for those who aren't super treble sensitive. Before I go, I just wanted to mention that although I think that the DT990 Pro is still the better option overall for games, especially first-person shooter ones, I feel like the SHP9600 with a mod mic does make for a very good contender as an open-back gaming solution, since I feel like its imaging is clean enough and precise enough to keep up with the requirements for competitive online games, and when you consider its efficiency, the fact that it doesn't need an amplifier, I feel like it's actually more suitable for across a wider array of setups and systems. Anyways, that is all from me today. I hope you enjoyed this video or found it useful. If you did, do consider dropping a like. And if you want to learn more about the SHP9600 or lots of other headphones, I highly encourage you to check out the review section available on headphones.com, which has dozens of articles. For more headphone audio content, subscribe to the Headphone Show. And until next time, this is Chrono signing off.